Hello everybody and welcome to this webinar from Curo Compensation. My name is Ruth Thomas and I'm the industry principal and also a co-founder here at Curo, and I'm going to be taking you through this webinar today. Well, thankfully January is finally over. I'm sure many of us are glad to see the back of that month, and I hope many of you have now completed your compensation reviews or at least are coming to the end of them and will be starting to focus on planning for the next performance or financial year. So this webinar today is going to focus on some best practice tips and pitfalls as we enter the 2018-19 financial year, and hopefully equip you with some thoughts as you go into that planning process and thinking ahead. So let's start with our agenda for today. So I'll start with some brief housekeeping and introductions before moving on to today's content, where I'm going to be starting off looking at the goals of reward management before moving on to look at some of the common pitfalls of the compensation review process. And then if we have sufficient time, I will allow some questions at the end. So just from a housekeeping perspective, you're obviously all on mute on this webinar. When we get to the question part, I'll explain how you can submit questions that will be typed in through the chat box in the Join Me panel that you can hopefully all see on your screen somewhere. If you don't want to ask a question during the webinar, that's fine. You can please get in touch with us after. I'll end today's webinar with the contact details on the page. We are recording this session and we'll make that available through our website after the event, and you can also request a copy of the PDF version of the deck if you'd like to have that for reference in the future. So you can just get in touch with us and request a copy of that deck. So just a quick introduction to Curo for those of you who are new to us and haven't been on one of our webinars before. We're an HR software provider and we focus on total compensation management solutions. And we have 3 products in our portfolio aimed at different sizes of companies and to meet different reward challenges. So our main product is our Curo Enterprise product, and that's a fully configurable solution for helping companies manage their compensation review processes. We will be releasing soon this year our Curo Lite product, which is a more out-of-the-box, lighter in functionality version of our main enterprise product, and that's geared at small to medium-sized businesses. And we also released for the UK legislation, for compliance with the UK legislation, a gender pay gap reporting tool last month. So that's specifically geared at UK legal entities who need to comply with the equal pay legislation here in the UK. We have over 70 clients on our platform, many of whom are operating globally across many different currencies. And we have a growing list of partners with whom we work either for implementation services or to help us to distribute our product. And here are some examples of the clients with whom we work. And if you'd like to find any more about our company, our products, then please do get in touch, where you can find information at the Curo Comp website. Okay, so let's go on to the content for today's webinar. So before we get sucked into looking at those tips and pitfalls, I just wanted to press pause and revisit what we're actually trying to achieve. What are the goals of reward management? Because I think that will provide useful context for what I will cover following that. So I think it's worth revisiting these 3 key principles. Firstly, on a broader level in HR, it's all about managing human capital, and our focus should be on delivering business imperatives through people. But in order to do that, you need to leverage and engage people, or rather employees. So we need to focus on the need to attract, engage, motivate, and retain employees. And I think we're all familiar with that sort of bedrock of attract, engage, and retain employees forms probably the main part of our reward philosophy statements. When it comes to reward specifically, we know that reward influences who is in your workforce and how they behave. So our role really has to be about optimizing compensation spend so that the amount of money spent on pay, which can often account for the largest part of organizational expenditure, we have to make sure that it's being spent efficiently and ultimately looping back to that first imperative, helping us to deliver business imperatives through people. So what do you need to think about in terms of optimizing compensation spend? Well, when set against a background of a war for talent and weak labour productivity, business leaders are recognising that what we need to do is to get employees to work smarter, not necessarily harder, and create more with the same amount of input and find new ways of working. And this challenge is leading some more innovative employers to consider new approaches to managing talent from both a performance and reward perspective. More and more, we're working with companies who are introducing key business and individual performance metrics into their reward programs through their incentive schemes, rather than using a discretionary allocation approach. And also, as a result, initially of the financial crisis back in 2008, we are seeing the need to reward and recognise correct behaviours rather than the risk-taking behaviours that perhaps contributed to that crisis coming into play. And so therefore, that is becoming an important part of the needing to be incorporated into your reward equation. Pay equity is obviously increasingly important. I think, the last couple of years, we've seen a lot more legislation coming out, both in the UK and the US, in respect of equal pay legislation. And also there's this need to react to employee expectations about pay transparency. Very much, it's been talked about as a millennial desire, but I think in this information age, workers of all ages across the workforce are expecting more and more to be able to understand why they're paid, what they're paid, and they also have, access readily available through the internet to pay data. And as I mentioned, there's been an increasing amount of legislation impacting reward in the last 5 to 8 years, and we need to make sure always that we're adhering to this at the same time as optimizing our compensation spend. Okay, so against this framework, what should we be thinking about in terms of best practice for the forthcoming year? And I'm going to approach this from the perspective of looking at some of the common pitfalls that we sometimes fall into. And for the sake of an analogy, I'm going to call them the 7 deadly sins. So, sin 1, too much focus on process and not enough on outputs. For many of us, the compensation cycle has become an event-driven activity each year, which is all-consuming from a time perspective. And to some degree, it has become a mechanical exercise with little or no strategic context or value. And in reward, we often get caught in this vortex of managing that process, deriving timetables, getting bogged down chasing spreadsheets, corralling data, handling those tricky exception populations, and as a result, find ourselves too busy to fully contribute and add value. And as a result, sometimes the approach is just to dust off last year's process rather than considering what are those key business imperatives that we need to think about supporting and delivering on for the coming year. And often those complex processes that I've talked about have evolved with some very interesting workarounds, which are often band-aids and they don't really address the real issues. So before you dive into preparation for the next year, have a think about, how you manage your process and how you can try and automate as much of that process to give yourself time to think about adding value. My second sin is too much focus on budget size. And those of you who may have attended our webinars before, I have spoken about this need to shift the focus in how we think about the cost of compensation within an organisation, and stop thinking of it as a cost to be minimised, which I think is how many of us tend to manage pay today. It is a large proportion of our budget, we know that. And I know as part of any compensation review, we spend an awful lot of time making sure that we're allocating within budget. and on budget, and reporting against that. And often, particularly in the current environment where you've got very restrained wage growth and it's hard to differentiate on pay, pay increases are seen as just a cost of doing business. But really, in today's business environment, I've talked about the low productivity, we need to shift this approach to where pay and reward are seen as an investment for the organisation, which has to be optimised and will help us to leverage our human capital. And to do this, you really need to be able to, first of all, understand what you're currently paying for in your organisation. And although many of us will say, yes, we know what we pay for, actually, doing a full audit of understanding what your current reward policies are actually addressing in terms of pay. And then make sure you know what you want to pay for the forthcoming year. And then most importantly, thinking about how you can measure the ROI on that compensation spend. And I think, we're often very good at articulating our reward strategy and our reward principles that attract, we use reward to attract, retain, and motivate our employees. But what are we actually doing to measure whether we're actually delivering on that? And that sort of takes me on to my next sin 3. So weak reward governance. So I think, what we often see is a failure to measure reward effectiveness and delivery of our key reward principles. And in order to actually do that, you need to establish a framework of key performance indicators to help you to assess whether you're delivering on those reward principles. So, what might those look like? Well, I think it's about, identifying the various ways that you can manage to measure performance on your reward strategy. And there are different ways of doing that. Some of those may be statistical. You can see an example that I'm putting up here from the Hay Group that appeared in the World at Work journal. And here they're sort of giving some of the measures that you may use to assess the effectiveness of your ROI on your compensation spend. So some of those will be hard reporting, things like external benchmarking. Some of them will be, doing analysis on perceptions of reward, effectiveness, fairness, competitive preferences. But also importantly will be things about capturing employee and manager opinions, which is not often we do to any great depth through our engagement surveys. And the attached is also, here's another example of some sort of drawing up metrics or KPIs to help you establish whether you're delivering on your reward principles. So on my left, I have some key reward principles, and on my right, there's a list of the KPIs that I'm going to use to measure those. So when we talk about performance-driven reward, for example, what we're looking at is whether the actual salary increases and bonuses for exceptional performers, were compared to strong performers. And we're looking at rating distribution and pay distribution. But we're also, looking at asking our employees, for example, through the employee survey, does your compensation match your performance? And also, asking employees whether they feel that the firm uses compensation to give adequate recognition of good performance. So there are lots of different ways you can format these KPIs, but if you're starting your process of planning for this year, maybe this is a good place to start in terms of thinking, how can we actually measure whether we're delivering on our reward principles? Okay, my fourth sin is sometimes we go down this route of a one-size-fits-all approach. We know today that organisations have become much more diverse and complex as a result of ageing workforce, different types of workers in the workforce, and globalisation. And it's becoming increasingly apparent that one size doesn't fit all anymore when it comes to trying to engage all our employees and deliver the employee experience. And it's definitely a delicate balance between maintaining a consistent approach to your reward philosophy and principles whilst trying to meet the needs of different employees and jurisdictions. But you can have a common set of reward principles that execute differently for different populations. So I think, increasingly we're going to need to think about how we can adapt our reward approaches for the different types of employee and the different types of employee expectations that we will have within the workforce. But one thing to think about when going down the segmentation route is don't be too tempted to get too complex. I've worked with some companies helping them to transform their processes with our software, and during the discovery phase it can take me 2 or 3 attempts to actually understand their compensation plans or their bonus schemes. Simplicity is always critical in pay design because you need managers and employees to be able to easily make the link between performance and reward, or output and reward, or input and reward for it to be effective. Whilst I'm talking about the one-size-fits-all approach, I'm also going to mention pay differentiation here. We are generally seeing, and it's because of an issue that I mentioned earlier, restrained wage increases. We're seeing very weak pay differentiation or lack of pay differentiation. There's a tendency, potentially to just, give everybody the same level of increase, or because of the pay budgets being, around that 2.5 to 3% mark, it's very hard to actually differentiate our high performers in those restrained budgets. And that's often referred to as the peanut butter approach to compensation. But in today's economic environment, we really need to think about move from spreading limited budgets thinly to optimizing spend that focuses on high performers. And I know, many organizations have taken steps to do this, but it is tough. And there are some really hard messages to deliver to the employees who may not end up getting an increase as a result of that redistribution. My 5th sin is around lack of data readiness. And I know data is often one of the most time-consuming parts of any compensation review process, with most of us spending a significant proportion of time gathering, corralling, and interpreting data. And some of the key issues I see organizations facing, firstly, is actually getting hold of data that is accurate. Actually, it's quite interesting. At a recent client event, we were talking about the accuracy of data and how comfortable they were if we were moving to a year-round solution for compensation management. And a number of the clients said that actually the only time they feel comfortable that their pay data is 100% accurate is at the time they've cleaned it and going into their compensation review. And that's obviously something we need to get better at. But it's not just about getting the right data, it's the ability to be able to calibrate the different parts of data, the different sorts of data that we need in order to make effective compensation decisions. So that's calibrating pay data, performance, talent metric data, and of course benchmarking data. And if you're still working on spreadsheets, that's a difficult task because you're trying to pull together data held in multiple sources. And pulling all this data together often falls to 1 or 2 people within an organization without whom the process would fall over. And that in itself is a problem. So we end up with this key man dependency. And that's a key risk for many people when it comes to managing their compensation review processes. And I think it's probably fair to say that we've been traditionally bad at managing data in HR, but with the increasing adoption of new cost-effective software as a service or cloud-based technology, and with BI tools starting to be integrated into HR platforms, it really is time to up our game. And we need to take that step from simply processing and reporting on information to using the data we have to provide insight and decision support to our business managers. My 6th sin is treating the compensation process or the compensation management process as if it's our process, it's an HR-owned process, and really losing sight of who the other participants are and what their requirements are. So who are they? Okay, well, sort of at the macro level, you've got your company and shareholders who obviously want to maximize compensation spend to ensure we get employee engagement and productivity. So they have their own agenda. And that's really what our reward strategy is about delivering on. But we also have employees in this process who want to know that their contribution and skills are being recognized and that they're being paid fairly, which is a critical part of the reward engagement equation. And then we have the business leaders, the managers, whose job it is to reward and retain key talent. And so we really need to empower them to make business decisions. And speaking to many of the companies with whom we work, that there's often this fear of empowering managers or giving managers data. We worry about them making the wrong decisions. We worry about them making silly decisions. We worry about them making illegal decisions. And I think, what we really have to do is to achieve an effective transfer of process here is to make sure that we are empowering managers with the information they need, the tools they need to make optimal pay decisions. And that's why many people will move to an automated solution, for example, because it will be able to deliver that information in a more user-intuitive manner that have inbuilt checks and balances that stop managers doing the wrong things within the system. And so breaking any of your reward policies or any of your key protocols that you need them to adhere to. And I think particularly if you think about a world where we were moving towards more continuous approaches of managing performance and potentially pay in line with that, many organisations, we know, are abandoning their annual performance evaluation and moving to this more continuous approach to performance management. Then empowering managers, because they're the ones who will be having those continuous conversations with employees, they really need to be empowered and have the information to hand. My final sin is maybe perhaps one of the most important, which is poor communication and no feedback loop. So often, having got to the end of the review process, there's this tendency to breathe a huge sigh of relief. And as I said, this communication phase for employees particularly is probably the most critical. And reward communications are really important for creating perceptions of reward, fairness, and equity. Communicating reward issues poorly can erode those perceptions. And as I've said many times before, for those of you who attended my webinars before, you'll know that engagement on reward is often not about how much someone has been paid, but whether they've been paid fairly. And there's a lot of research studies that back that up. I'm also mentioning feedback here, not just communication to employees, because I think as I said earlier, and when I talked about key performance indicators, I think it's really important to make sure you gather feedback from all the stakeholders in the process. So you want to talk to your managers, you want to talk to your business leaders, you want to talk to your employees on how the process went. We do it from a project perspective with our clients. We'll always have a post-implementation review, and as part of that, we encourage them to collect feedback from the users of our solution. And I know, many of the clients I talk to, they do their own post-compensation review process to gather information and feedback on how the process went. But I think it is really important, you can either do that as part of your annual engagement survey, or now, there are so many feedback tools available that it's easy really to deploy a quick solution at the end of your compensation review process, which is probably the best time to do that when it's fresh in everybody's minds, to capture that feedback. And that can really help in terms of input into measuring your key performance indicators. So that's my 7 deadly sins when it comes to compensation, and hopefully some food for thought for those of you as you start to think about planning for the next year. And in terms of a recap there, in terms of planning for the next year, I guess these are some of the tips that I would give you. Don't get lost in the process. It's very easy to do because it can be so time consuming, but always ensure that your strategic context is reinforced. Start to think about this shift from thinking of compensation as a cost to be minimized to an investment to be maximized, and thinking about how you can start to build in some KPIs to measure the ROI on that compensation spend, both through the year and at the end of your compensation review. Make sure as you build your processes and your communications for the forthcoming year and your policies that you're thinking about how you engage and empower all stakeholders. So all too often compensation design, which tends to happen at this time of year, for example, happens within the remit of the HR function or the reward function without enough engagement with employees and with business leaders. I've said this already, but make sure you put in place tactics to measure your reward effectiveness, and make sure that you are data ready. And I think this, this is probably the time when we start talking to the most organizations who are looking for help in terms of improving their processes and improving their data management, because they've been through the pain of their most recent compensation process, and they're now starting to think about, how can we improve that process for next year? And for many of them, that is, thinking about automating their process. But, working with those people, maybe working with your HRIS provider, working with your payroll providers, and just trying to make sure now, what are the actions that we can take to improve data to make the process a lot easier as we approach it for the next financial year. And it's also important, I haven't addressed this specifically here, but to think about future-proofing your reward strategy. And think about, that's where you start to think about what are the business imperatives for your business, what type of skills do you need in your business for the next 12 to 24 months, and is your reward strategy addressing those, or are you just using a reward process that you've been using for the last 2 to 3 to 4 years? And we haven't timetabled it yet, but one of our next webinars will be specifically addressing some of the challenges of the workplace and some of the future tactics for reward, and we'll be publishing the dates for that soon. So if you fancy hearing a bit more about how you might future-proof your reward strategy, then look for that and those dates, and we'd look forward to seeing you again on another webinar. Okay, at that point, I'm going to just allow you to ask any questions. I know a few of you have joined during the session, so just to remind you, you can submit a question using the chat box, which you can hopefully see at the top of your screen or wherever your Join Me panel is, and I can see a question coming in. I'll try and answer some of these now. If you don't want to ask questions now, that's fine. You can just get in touch with us afterwards, so I'll put up the contact details. You can get in touch with us through any of these mediums. And as I did say at the beginning, for those of you who weren't necessarily here, we have recorded the session, so you can get a playback of that through our website. And if you'd like a copy of the deck, then get in touch with us and we can provide you with that. Okay, so that wasn't a question, that was just a thank you. But I'll just leave it for a couple of minutes to see if anybody has any more questions. And if not, I'd like to thank you all very much for joining our session today. I hope you found that useful, and we look forward to seeing you at some of our future sessions. And we'll always be posting those on our website there at www.curocomp.com. If you go to our events page, you'll be able to see all our forthcoming and planned events, which include webinars and other types of activities. Okay, thanks very much then everybody, and we look forward to seeing you again soon.